Today on the Perception in Action podcast, my interview with Wolfgang Schollhorn from the University of Mainz. A deep dive into differential learning. On what foundations is it based? What are some of the principles a coach can use in applying it? What effects does it have? So it's time for a call to action. Hi everyone, this is Rob Gray from ASU and perceptionaction.com. Welcome to the Perception in Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. In today's episode, I'm really excited to share my conversation I had with Wolfgang Schollhorn. We discuss his work on coordination profiling and what it has shown about the role of individuality and variability in skilled performance, why noise is essential for perceptual-motor control, and then we focus on differential learning. How does it promote skill acquisition? And what are some practical guidelines for how to use it effectively? Hope you learn as much as I did from this. Okay, today my guest is Wolfgang Schollhorn from the University of Mainz. Thank you for taking some time to talk with me.
It's my pleasure.
So to start off with, can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got interested in kind of skill acquisition research?
Okay. How much time do I have?
As much
Yeah, okay. Well, I think my theory reflects my life, which is actually that I've been a gymnast quite successfully. Then I became too tall. Then I switched to Olympic handball. Then I was a member in the state team there, but I injured my knees. Then I switched to decathlon. I was again a member in the state team. Then I became curious for bobsledding. Then I switched to the national team in bobsleigh, became German champion and vice European champion. And already during this time, I realized that the theory and the practice are quite different. And because when I was a student in physical education sports, I had to earn some money by being a coach. And I always applied my ideas as a coach as well. And in a very short time, I was able to bring them to German championship too. Wow. And one characteristics of this was that it was, I would say, totally different than what is normally taught in textbooks. And the main idea behind this was that I want to get extraordinary athletes, so I need to have extraordinary training. Mm. And I think it was 1993. I quit my job as a coach and focused more on research. And then I started to develop a theory or to look for models which could fit to the things which I already applied. Then, in this case, I studied physics, I studied neurophysiology, and I studied pedagogy and mixed all together. And I think the most influence had neurophysiology and dynamic systems in physics. And this is what I immediately applied in pattern recognition, because what we did during my doctor thesis, and even longer than this, more than 10 years, that we consulted and analyzed a lot of national teams here in Germany. And at this time, there was still ongoing the Cold War between East and West. So West Germany was always fighting against East Germany in sports as well. And we did this in sports science too. So it was very, I would say, ambitious and very competitive to develop new methods. And one thing was there already that I've realized that the time discrete and group average approach is not very successful. It doesn't help an athlete, and actually it doesn't help the science at all. It's more, I would say, satisfying some ego things. So at this time, and this was already 1990, I developed a method how you can analyze the people by means of their time process. Because until then, we were only taught to analyze the movements by discrete values. Mm-hmm. So by the maximum or by the beginning or by the end. And what we realized, okay, we could see the difference, but we couldn't quantify the difference in those learning processes. So I started to work a little bit more in signal analysis. And the thing which you could read then with pattern recognition and person identification was actually the main idea which I had in the beginning. One background for this was already that I knew from pedagogy, all these from German sports pedagogy, that these self-organizing things and nonlinear pedagogy things, which have been discussed already in the 1970s, they are very interesting, but they have a lack in I would say, quantifying and showing some proof for this.
Okay.
So it was a major issue for me to find a method how you can verify the things which have been known already there. And I think this was the reason why Keith Davids got in contact with me too. And I think this method opened the floor to the practical area there too. Because what you see in the Keith Davids approach is they were discussing a lot very interesting things for more than 7 years. Mm-hmm. And after I gave them the approach, how to analyze this quantitatively, then it was a kind of exploding and it was applicable. Mm-hmm. Before this, I think it was quite theoretical, and you can see this in all the papers. At the end, they were encouraging the people to do more research in this, and we need some quantitative verification and testing hypothesis. And I came from biomechanics, and I offered already the possibility for this. So this actually opened the floor for the consequence-led approach. Yes.
So that's kind of the might you call coordination profiling, where, part of the way I think of it, you kind of turned it on its head is by looking for more what's different. A traditional way we do research is what's the same by taking be expert athletes, like what's the average performance, and your approach is more looking at what's individually different. And is that kind of a way that you think it? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think this is related to my history, mm-hmm. that even already when I was an athlete, I had to look, what do I have to change in order to become better? And then I did the same with my athletes. Okay, now you became German champion. Now what do we have to change in order to advance even more? So my thinking was about how to change things, and in order to be, I would say, to be better than the other ones. So it was always a kind of a comparison. And in parallel, I studied some philosophy, mm-hmm. And I think it's well known that one of the major philosophies of the last century was the deconstructivism from Derrida. And I like this idea to deconstruct common idea, going back to the assumptions, and then prove the assumptions, whether the assumptions are correct. If they are correct, then try to build back again the system. And if you will end up in the same, it's quite successful. It's a good proof for the system. But normally you will end up that the assumptions are, I would say, not acceptable. Mm-hmm. So the assumption problem was about the individuality and about the repeatability, mm-hmm. Actually with the reliability. And this is an even bigger problem. And what I knew from my professorship in East Germany is that one of the major sports scientists from Russia, from Soviet Union, Matveyev, was asked from at this time from Stalin to find some training principles which will make it possible to beat the Americans in the next Olympic Games. So he went all over Soviet Union, and surprisingly, he came back and said, okay, the major principle is the principle of individuality. So this was the first principle, and there were 5 or 6 other ones. But then it was translated by the East Germans, and the East Germans realized already individuality doesn't fit together with the communism. So they had to make a compromise. So they changed this principle of individuality to the principle of individualization and shifted it back to the 8th place. So in the beginning, everyone had to train the same, mm-hmm. but in order to become successful at the end, it was allowed to train individually. And they never could explain to me why it's not possible to do it from the beginning. Because you see the same when you have children, you see that every children is different, especially when you have a group of children. I think it's much easier to train successful athletes than a group of little children.
Yeah, no, I think you're right in the kind of the traditional approach of we got to give you the technique first. Everybody the same basic technique first, and then individualized is kind of it's kind of backwards to what we do as kids, very much.
Yeah, and I still remember that when I started to study physical education, I asked the professor, what was who was the teacher of the first who invented this technique? Mm-hmm. So there's a problem with this role model philosophy. But when you go back into history, all the people who developed the things by themselves, they normally achieved a big record, and the record was holding for a long time.
Oh, that's really interesting. And one of the methods that I know you've used for this is a self-organizing map. Is that one of the kind of approaches that you've used? Can maybe a little bit about what that is generally?
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, self-organizing map is just a mathematical method to classify big data.
Okay.
And this was the classical approach in the 90s, where we started to classify our movement data. Mm-hmm. This was in cooperation with a physicist who was working with the brain department here in Frankfurt. And difference between the self-organizing maps and the MLP, multi-layer perceptron, is that in multi-layer perceptron, you need actually a role model, and you always give feedback to the system until the model is doing what you are expecting to do.
Okay.
Whereas in the self-organizing map, you give in all the data, and the self-organizing map is classifying the data according to the principles which are derived from neurons.
Okay.
Which means that it's classifying by similarity. So Ulrich Bauer, he knew this approach from cats' visual cortex. When they see certain figures and forms and whatever, then you can actually map these forms to the visual cortex according to the similarity in space. And my knowledge was from neurophysiology. Okay, when this works in the visual cortex, then we know, okay, the cortex is all over the same structure. So the motor in the somatosensory cortex should work with the same principles. So when you apply this to the biomechanical variables, which correspond to certain physiological sensors, then you should come up with a similar structure. And this was the reason why we chose angles, angular velocities, and angular accelerations, because we know in skin and joints and wherever we have these Ruffini corpuscles and Merkel cells and whatever, and they exactly correspond to these physical parameters.
Okay.
So actually it was a first attempt, a very simple attempt to get access to the neurological structuring of the brain.
Okay. That's right. So you're looking at these, you're taking all these biomechanical variables and looking at patterns and
yes.
Is cluster, is it
yes,
a type of cluster analysis, would you call it? I know it's more than the simple.
No.
Yeah.
It's right. It's a kind of nonlinear cluster analysis.
Okay.
Cluster analysis is looking for linear separation, and self-organizing maps are doing this in a nonlinear way, yes.
Mm-hmm. Basically, you're finding these different a lot of individual differences in, or the clusters are looking at groups of athletes, or can you do that within?
In the beginning, we did it in an exploratory approach. Mm-hmm. So we didn't know what will this end up. Mm-hmm. We just gave all the data in and classified, and then you get out some clusters, mm-hmm. and afterwards you have to look whether you can find some criteria why it was clustered in this way. And this was the first time when we saw these individual things. Mm-hmm. So we in javelin throwing, out of 51 throws, we could exactly identify 10 throws of one subject and 6 of the other one. And if you go to statistics and you look for the probability in order to find exactly 10 in a row out of 51, mm-hmm. it's way beyond normal significance. And actually, it meets the criteria for forensic cases.
Wow, that's really interesting. Yeah. I also I don't think we do this enough sometimes, is trying to understand the phenomenon we're going to investigate or train first before we start coming up with theories of it. So describing coordination and understanding, I think that's a really good approach to doing it before we run off on theories of how it works, right? Understanding what we're looking at first. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this again related to my experience, because we were consulting all the national coaches in javelin throwing, and they always told us, okay, the throwing arm, the elbow has to be extended completely. So we measure this, we analyze this with best technique at this time, and we saw there's no fully extended elbow. And the same to the knee, and actually from a logical point of view, it does make sense, because there is a reflex in the knee, and you have to bend the knee for a short moment. But it's a difference whether you see this or whether you instruct this. So I knew, okay, the perception of the coach and what we measure is a big difference. So it's better to first to measure and derive independent of the, I would say, previous theory of these coaches, and look what's coming out of just analyzing the data. Because what we meanwhile know is that most of the coaches are just reproducing what they have been taught. And this was, to my point of view, this was too narrow.
Yeah. And they're seeing what they want to see a lot, to kind of confirmation. Yeah. Building on this and turn to, the thing you're probably well known for, in my area at least, differential learning. It sounds like it was kind of evolved from your experience as an athlete or a coach, but was there a particular kind of genesis of this, the theory of differential learning for you, or just something that kind of evolved over time?
I think it evolved over time. So as I told that I varied a lot by these things. And this is what I have observed just by watching little children. So watching little children during the first 2 years, surprisingly, they don't listen to the parents. They cry whenever they want. They sleep whenever they want. But what we knew from Esther Thellen's work is that there is no system which learns more effectively than children during the first 2 years. In parallel, I was in Barcelona already and was observing these teams. And what I saw there as well is that always the best players always have some trouble with the coach, because they want to go their individual way. And the coach still had in mind, I have to control everything. And only if the coach was accepting the freedom, and I think you have the same experience in the United States with the basketball team in Chicago. But he was able to do this. And this is actually what I did in a very small way as well. I had 20 different athletes. I had a javelin thrower, I had a discus thrower, I had a sprinter, I had a hurdle sprinter, all in one group. And I had to cope with them. And then you see immediately that repeating does not make a lot of sense. And actually, from a philosophical point of view, it's also an information theoretic point of view, an exact repetition doesn't provide any information. So actually, there's a lot of information coming out of the difference. And this is the reason why we have 2 eyes and why we have 2 ears, because the difference of both is providing the information about the space, etc. And this is in biomechanics also discussed as why we don't have completely symmetric legs. You need a kind of asymmetric biomechanics in order to get more information out of the system. Asymmetry should be within a certain area.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. Yeah, even what you're right, within information theory, information is reducing uncertainty, right? So when you repeat the same thing, you're right. There's no new information there. But, theoretically, right, the kind of a fundamental change in differential learning is the role of noise in the motor system, even by its name, right? We've kind of treated it as a negative thing. Can you talk about how you've reconceptualized that?
Well, this is related to my studies in physics. And physics, noise is a normal neutral term. It's not considered as nuisance as in common language. So for us, noise was always a kind of constructive thing. It could be destructive and also constructive. And what you see in history is that our negative associations with noise is mainly coming from the signal theoretic part, where Shannon and Weaver, they had a known signal, and the signal was disturbed by some noise. but they knew about the signal. And when you know about the signal, then you can extract the noise.
Mm-hmm.
But when you don't know about the signal, then you don't know what part is the noise.
Mm-hmm.
So at this time, I already read the works from Haken and Gregor Schöner. And this was the reason why I saw there a lot of potential in there. But what I saw there as well is that the common understanding of noise was very limited. Because, in order to describe the noise, some physicists, for a special case, derived a method to quantify the noise by means of frequency contents.
Okay.
So normally they are talking about white noise. But there's already one problem. In order to measure the frequency of a noise, frequency contents of a noise, you need to have a certain sample rate,
mm-hmm.
which means equidistance measurement. But this is what we don't have in training. Sometimes we have 5 seconds break, we have 10 seconds break, we have whatever. We cannot provide this kind of thing. So it's hard to measure this kind of noise with this special case, which has been suggested by one physicist. And this is what a lot of people have a problem. And this is what, I know from physics, it's just noise. It's some disturbing model. And you can go around this if you not measure the signal, if you make a scale transformation, if you go to entropy and you don't go for the time scale.
Okay.
And then you look for the noise of the entropy. And then what we know in physics as well is, when you talk about noise, everyone normally asks immediately, what kind of noise? Do you have white noise, brown noise, pink noise, red noise, or whatever? It's highly dependent on the frequency distribution. And actually, when you know about a Fourier transform, then you know that every signal can be constructed by any combination of sine waves.
Mm-hmm.
So actually, every signal has a special frequency content. But on the opposite side, when you have a certain frequency content, you can derive the signal. So a noise does not mean immediately random, which is only the white noise.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what is very often misunderstood in my formulation with stochasticity,
mm-hmm.
because, and I think you explained this very nicely in one of your podcasts, that stochasticity doesn't mean it's 5, 7, 3, 2. No, it could also be 1, 2, 3, 4.
Mm-hmm.
It also could be 1, 1, 1, and so on. But when you go deeper into this, you will get a lot of other problems with statistics.
Yeah.
I think this is going beyond the scope of here.
So this very narrow ideal situation where Shannon, they had the idea of what noise and the signal to noise ratio, and you're right. What you're talking about, your understanding is way beyond my level, but it reminded me of kind of an aliasing also, right? So when you sample, depending on the rate at which you sample, like as you mentioned as a coach, where you can actually distort the signal, right? In the kind of
yes.
in what you're measuring.
Yes.
So the general problem here is we don't know what the signal is to begin with, unlike the example of a radio communication.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
We don't know what the signal is, and I think even if we have a coarse clue about the signal, it's just, I would say, very uncertain because it's changing all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what we saw in these top athletes. We analyzed, and unfortunately this was never published, but we analyzed all the world record holders in shot put.
Okay.
And actually it was the task of my doctor father. He told me, please find the ideal technique for shot putting. So I was looking for a world record holder and I didn't find anything but what I found is exactly, Timmermann is moving in this way, Schmidt Bayer is moving this way, and Günther is moving this way. So immediately after the first step, I could tell who the athlete is. And then they were always fluctuating. Even if you choose, you are 2 meters tall and 130 kilos heavy, you choose Werner Günther, then you don't know which of his trials will be the model. And if you look for his development over 10 years, you still see a change in there. but you immediately could identify him by his movement pattern. Although for everyone, it's looking like shot put. And this is what we do at the moment, that we are analyzing gait patterns, because in the gait patterns, we think that there is a lot more repetition in there, which actually should lead to I would say, more narrow movement pattern.
Okay.
But with our more sensitive tools, we are, I think, able to identify even emotions. We can identify the greater fatigue. We can identify everything. And meanwhile, we are able to identify changes in the movement patterns already after half an hour.
Wow.
After half an hour, the movement pattern is changing by 85 to 90%, and they will never come back.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That reminds me of work on eye movements now. People have identified that, when we think people are fixating, they're actually making something called microsaccades. So they're moving their eyes around. So you're right. Maybe a lot of the things that we think are not variable are actually due to the resolution of our tools for measuring it. Yeah. Moving it to skill, like relating to skill. So, the idea is there's variability in those kind of patterns of joint angles and things you're talking about. And the traditional approach is that we can identify the signal, your arm should be at this angle, and all the other variants of it are the noise that we want to get rid of, right? Where you're reconceptualizing, we don't know the signal. And if you look at athletes, there's no one signal within even the same athlete. Yeah.
Yeah, this is again related to a philosophical question. Mm-hmm. It's the asymmetry of right and false. And this is going back actually to the Popper theory of falsification, that, okay, when we are talking about the false thing, wrong movement, it suggests, I would say, that we know about the right. Mm-hmm. But if we don't find the right, how can we tell what is wrong? So it's a philosophical question there as well. Yeah, good to that you mentioned the eye saccades. This is what I have heard quite early in the brain science studies, that our eye needs to move with a frequency of 1570 hertz in order not to adapt the retina. Because when you fix the eye, then you see nothing within a very short time. And when you wear glasses and you have made some tests, you have experiences already. When they fix this eye with a prism, then the picture disappears within a couple of seconds. It's a natural thing that our whole body, and this is what J.J. Collins has found in muscular area, needs some noise in order to be more sensitive to the environment.
Right. Yeah, I know. I've heard you use the phrase essential noise. Like, it is essential to a lot of the physiological processes. Another example I think of is heart rate variability.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Have no variability in your heart rate is bad. It's a sign that there's something seriously wrong. You want it to be unpredictable, right? So that's kind of the athlete side. So turning to the training side of, the challenging concept, the stochastic resonance, how you bring out this good variability by the other side of the variability. Obviously, there's variability in the practice conditions that you kind of connect with the variability within the athlete themselves. So can you talk a little bit about that kind of process, the resonance process?
Yeah, okay. Again, I would like to start with an experience. It was 1996 when we were asked to coach the silver medalist in Atlanta in decathlon, Busemann. And we started already with this differential thing, with the extreme version of differential training, where we change every movement. But he had another athlete at his side, and he had to stop after 10 minutes because he was a kind of dizzy, and he didn't like the things. So we knew already that if you change all the time, for some people, it's too hard.
Okay.
But then we immediately applied for him, let's go with 3 repetitions. And then he could manage this.
Okay.
This was just by intuition. Meanwhile, we have a neurological evidence why it was 3, but at this time it was just intuitively. So we knew that the so-called optimum noise is dependent on the individual. And this was the idea that, okay, there must be a resonance between the coach and the athlete. Okay, the athlete offers a certain amount of noise by repetition. Mm-hmm. And the coach is offering noise by offering a different variation of exercises. So actually, I would say this, what has been published is a very simple version of what I have applied already when I was a coach. So actually, it's a kind of, the athlete has a noise and the coach offers the noise in order to intervene into this process. But the noise of the coach is dependent on what he sees in the noise of the athlete. Okay, so when he sees, okay, there's a lot of variation in the knee, then the next exercise is, I would say, emphasizing enlarging this arrow. Okay. So there's a time shift of one exercise. So the major issue actually of differential learning is to learn to see the small differences. So right from the beginning, there was an interaction between the coach and the athlete. In the publication, I would say this was just a simplified version in order to get some ideas published. Mm-hmm. Because this approach, which I applied already in practice, is quite hard to, I would say, to do this in a systemized way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it doesn't fit with our traditional everybody doing the same in a certain group. Yeah.
And in the beginning, it was enough to say, okay, we varied all the time. But then they started to ask, okay, what type of exercises did you do? And then they asked, okay, in which sequence you did. Mm-hmm. But actually, I think it's less dependent on the exercise than on the changes, on the differences, on the switches. And this is what we were investigating 3 years ago with the effect of differential learning on the brain. Mm-hmm. And what we saw there is, okay, when there's some surprising event in the things, then you have bigger effects in the brain. This resonance mainly should lead to a certain brain state for optimal learning. This is, meanwhile, we have some idea about this, that this is dependent on the need of control of the athlete. So when he needs when he has a natural need for controlling the things, then we need to go for more repetitions. But if they are totally open and, I would say, curious, then you can switch all the time. It's mainly dependent on the control, which is coming from the frontal lobe. And this is the reason why we, meanwhile, go for the same experiments for Parkinsonians, which are well known for having a lot of, I would say, overemphasized control from the frontal lobe. Okay. And when we are able to change this control by lower frequencies, and this is mainly done by, or can be done by differential learning, then we see an enormous change in the symptoms.
Okay.
These are ongoing studies at the moment.
Okay.
This was the main idea. How can we change the brain state by means of different combinations of movements?
So you're looking both at kind of the existing variability of the athlete in terms of actually movement, and also sounds like kind of psychologically how engaged, how, if they're getting frustrated or, how open they are to dealing with lots of it. And so in designing variability for differential learning for a specific athlete, are you looking for it to be kind of proportional to their kind of variability they're already existing? Is that kind of the approach? Or more that, are you trying to push them to get more variable? Or?
Well, I would say as a normal coach, you don't have biomechanics in the background.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So you just see the things. Mm-hmm. Okay. And normally I would say you do the same with children. You don't measure them all the time and look for the variability. So I would say you give some intervention and you will look how they react on this intervention, mm-hmm. and how big this reaction will be according to this intervention. And by playing around, I would say you will get a feeling how sensitive they are to changes.
Okay.
So when the change is too big, then normally the system gets stiff. If they are still able to cope with this, I think you can increase the fluctuations, you can increase the noise, and actually it helps the coach and the athlete to learn about themselves. And this is, for me, the major idea of all education processes and also for training, to help the athlete to find his possibilities and to learn about his own body.
In terms of the actual variations themselves, are there any specific, the ones that you tend to use, different body postures, one eye closed, it sounds like the biggest thing is the change from, as you said, the one to the other, rather than they're not, the variations aren't designed to be anything that specifically fits with the competition scenario. Right? They're more, getting them to explore. Is that a fair?
Well, what we have suggested already from the beginning, this is related to my biomechanics background. Mm-hmm. Okay, if you have a beginner, then you vary more on the, I call this geometric level, which means that you are varying the angles. Okay, you have to run with extended arms. You have to run with left arm extended, right arm bent. In a more advanced level, you change the velocities. Okay, move the left arm fast, the right arm slow, vice versa, and whatever. You can do this with the legs and all the things. On the more advanced level, you can vary on the acceleration, and you can apply this to every joint. And on the highest level, you can vary on the rhythm level. And this is, again, related to the development of the brain area. What we know in brain area is that in the beginning, and this is how you can observe this with little children. Mm-hmm. In the beginning, they are happy to find the right geometry. And with more advanced, and this is exactly what you see in the brain, you only see, I would say, a representation of these angular sensors there. And in the highest level, only you see sensors which are sensitive to jerk, which mm-hmm. is the third derivative of the distance. So it's, again, just copying the phenomenon which we have read in the books about neurophysiology. So look about the development of the brain, and I think you can see what's going on outside.
So it's kind of going from position to rate of movement to, like you said, rhythm, pattern of movement.
This could be, but what we have seen in this silver medalist from Atlanta, he was very open, he was very talented, mm-hmm. and he needed to have a jump within these different levels. Mm-hmm. So for there, it was, I would say, the most important thing to surprise him with something. And this is what we know from learning approaches in the brain. When they are confronted with some surprising events, and they are able to cope with these events, then the brain is producing the most dopamine.
Okay.
But you need to have the surprise. When you just repeat, then almost nothing happens in the brain. And most probably this is the reason why elderly are no more learning that much, because I would say they avoid the surprises. So it's not dependent on the age. It's dependent on the way of learning. And this is what I've learned in brain studies too very early, that our brain is plastic until the highest age, until 90. Mm-hmm. But in order to keep this plastic, you need to have certain stimuli.
So it's going to be kind of this constant interaction between the coach and the athlete, right? Where you're going to have to, and maybe you're going to have to scale it back at some point when they're not, they might handle it for a while and then they're having a bad day, or,
Yeah. And this is what the reason why we put the dotted line on top of this curve, stochastic resonance curve, mm-hmm. because at this time we already were able to measure that the performance is dependent on the emotion, dependent on the fatigue, dependent on the smell. There are a lot of influences. Mm-hmm. And these influences are, I would say, the major reason why we will never repeat a movement twice.
Right. So what is I don't know if this is a way, this can be, what is the athlete acquiring here? Are they gaining the ability to, I don't know, this is not fit with the model particularly well.
No.
Are they acquiring the ability to adjust their degeneracy in response to kind of environmental variations, or?
Well, I think at the moment we don't know. Mm-hmm. Okay. The thing is, I think the traditional approach was mainly looking for the so-called signal.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, I think the signal is a side effect.
Okay.
Because if you build up a certain noise around the signal, and in this case, I really prefer the term noise or fluctuations in comparison to degeneracy, because coming from physics, okay, degeneracy, from history point of view, they had a certain spectrum, and afterwards they discovered, okay, there are some other spectra too. But this discovery was made in the 1920s, 1930s, and this was the time when the term degeneracy was very popular because of the Jews.
Okay.
So the major idea behind this is there is a central idea,
mm-hmm.
and then you have degenerate elements beside this, which puts too much emphasis on one signal.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, it's noise. Everything is the same.
Right.
And
okay.
This is, I think I'm not that familiar with the English language, but from coming from Latin, degenerate means there is something generic in it, and then you change the generic. So there's a connotation in this term, and I think it's not very advantageous to talk with degeneracy to athletes. But in our case, I would say yes, we need to have certain fluctuations which are dependent on the athlete as well as on the coach. I think it's never separatable. But in supplementary information to this, the published differential learning is where we gave only the instructions to change all the time. Mm-hmm. But this was a kind of compromise, because at the moment, the new generation is educated in a way that they just follow the instructions of the teacher or the coach. In a more advanced state, or when you have little children, then we ask the athlete or the child, do you have a solution for this problem? Okay, here you have a ball. How can you bring the ball over there 30 meters?
Okay.
Show me 5 different techniques. So they have to become creative. And already in this state, you can see how the interaction works. So if the athlete doesn't have ideas in the beginning, which happens very often, then you have to give some support. But you have to reduce the support in order to allow the athlete to find a solution by him or herself. I'm just supporting the system. And actually, the major idea, and this is what I've told already 2000 to Keith Davids too, it's to find the optimum noise. So when the athlete by himself is able to vary enough, then actually the coach does not need to intervene.
Okay.
The same for children, but the children most often are having too much noise. So you actually have to limit the noise a little bit. And this is the reason why in children, you are on the right side of this inverted U-shaped curve, whereas the longer they are in our school system, educational system, the more they are on the left side of this curve.
Okay. That's really interesting. Yeah, your point about degeneracy is because it's a positive thing in motor learning, but it's a very negative term. People always ask me about a degenerate is a bad thing, right? So it's interesting to hear where it came from, because people always ask me, why are you using a negative term to describe something we assume is positive?
It's coming from physics, and I looked for this.
Yeah.
In the time between 1850 and 1930, the term degeneracy was mainly used in order to separate the Jews and mainly the Nazi ideas. Mm-hmm. And actually, the origin of the term exactly describes this. So there's a central thing, and this is what Edelman also described, that he had a certain genetic thing, and then he had some derivations of this. But it was a kind of side effect, and so it was more emphasis on the first thing and less emphasis on the other ones. But for me, it's not good for developing tolerance to all the things.
Right. Back to the kind of analogy, one of the things we talked about, the eye, the jitter in the eye, the 15 to 18 hertz or what, is that kind of what you're trying to find in the athlete, the optimal, kind of amount of jitter or natural kind of variation for them that that makes you see clearly. I don't know if that's or makes you, instead of coming up with, degeneracy is also the idea we're not just finding one solution, but we're finding a small set, right? Which I don't think you would agree with. You're constantly changing and finding, this fluctuation.
I would say it's rather to learn to be able to adapt.
Okay.
Because what we meanwhile see is, and I'm feeling this already, our body is changing all the time. But when the body is changing all the time, then we have to adapt all the time our technique. And most probably we have to adapt the noise in our learning too. So for me, it's more to learn to adapt instead of learning a certain set of movements. Because for me, it doesn't make sense that you memorize 10 or 15 different solutions. It's when you exercise these 15 solutions, then you always have variations of this.
Okay.
So you are building up a kind of neural net grid, and then the net is able to interpolate between these exact grids.
That's really interesting. Yeah. So for kind of like I think we've talked about it a little bit, that like a practical for a coach wants to try to implement differential learning. It sounds like a lot of it is going to be trying and observing how the athlete responds to, you want, like you said, you want some surprises in from execution to execution, right?
Well, I would say this is the highest level.
Yeah.
To be honest, I needed about 20 years to develop these things, and it would be surprising for me if you would understand this immediately. Maybe I was too stupid, but
no.
Okay. No, what we are teaching the coaches normally in the beginning, and there it's a kind of differential learning in teaching tool where you have slowly to increase the fluctuations for the coaches.
Okay.
Which means, just start with a small amount of variation. Vary in the hip, vary in the shoulder, vary in the elbow. Stop. And then look for how often and in which frequency you are changing. And then you will see immediately that some other joints will be influenced. And there's one problem making this thing even more weird, that we are always confronted with some reflexes in our body. So the left foot angle is connected to the left wrist angle. So if there is still a reflex, then you can give a lot of instructions and this will not change anything. Then you first have to get rid of this reflex, which needs a special exercise. And I think at birth we have about 48 reflexes, and you can assume that every top athlete has still 5 reflexes in his body, which means that he needs a lot of energy to compensate these reflexes.
Okay.
But you only can get rid of these flexes when you put a lot of noise around this reflex. But for the coach, again, slowly start with this. And then in the next level, you can tell them, start with the ankle, start with the knee, go on with the knee, hip, and so on, a systematic thing. And then do this in a random way. But on the other side, I would say you just can continue as normally. So observe the athlete in detail and search for the error. What you consider as an error is nothing else than a fluctuation. Take this error and don't tell them to stop this. No, increase this error.
Okay.
Make more. And then continue watching instead of, and this is the limitation for me to contrast learning, which has been recommended by Platon already 2,000 years ago. It's not only about going one time for this contrast and then go back to the correct solution. No, stay with the contrast, and then in the whole body you will see other errors. So move all around the errors, and then you have perfect differential learning.
Yeah, it's very different than the traditional. You're not just amplifying the error, and you're right, and contrasting it. You're actually building off of it. That's a really interesting approach. One thing I wanted to ask you is, you've mentioned, I've already talked a lot about on the podcast about your differential learning studies and some of the benefits that you've seen. Can you talk a little bit about what you found in terms of, I know you've seen performance benefits, for example, relative to traditional technique instruction, prescriptive instruction. What are some of the other benefits that you've kind of seen in your research?
Well, those are the benefits 15 years ago. Meanwhile, we have seen, okay, when they do this for, I would say, 2 or 3 months, then we have heard, and I've observed this too, that I would say the character of the people are changing. They, especially in juveniles, they not only get better in sports, they get better in mathematics, they get better in language learning, they get better in school overall. This brought us to the idea to look more in detail what happens in the brain. And this is what we saw in the brain, and you see how long this needs to be prepared. We found this 2 years ago, that by doing differential learning, you come into a brain state which is very similar to a brain state which we know from meditation, which means that during this, you are producing the lower frequencies, alpha and theta. And what we know from yoga and Qigong studies, which we are doing in parallel, when you are producing these alpha theta waves every day just for 10 minutes, then after 1 month already, they were able to show a significant anatomical change of the amygdala, which is responsible for the, I would say, evaluation of emotions. And this seems to have an effect all over. It's not only for motor learning. And this was the reason why we now started to use differential learning as a preparation for certain school lessons, for learning mathematics. And the same we do now for Parkinsonians. As I mentioned, we have a new idea to go for multiple sclerosis, which are all associated with over control of the frontal lobe and brain. And mainly, we are looking for the individual approaches to change, I would say, the need for control of the athlete before training. And one sport which I did later on, where I tested the differential learning first by myself, was karate, where I achieved the brown black belt within very short time. And what you see in martial arts is that before they start to train, they meditate 5 minutes. And they do the same afterwards 5 minutes. And this is nothing else than preparing the brain for a more optimal learning state. And meanwhile, we have the same when we do differential learning before and after mathematics. We have better results in mathematics. So mainly this is also the approach what we did in Portugal with Sara Santos and Yoga Continuo, where they applied this in tactical learning, and they associated differential learning in tactics with more creativity. And this is what we already applied also in management sessions. When they do a little bit of yoga or differential learning before they go for the session, they are more creative, they are more tolerant, they find faster solutions. So it's an approach to, I would say, to get access to the brain by movement.
Yeah, I that's I think a thing we don't explore enough, the value of movement beyond doing our goals, immediate goals. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting. Thank you for taking some time to talk with me today. That was really helpful for me. I learned a lot about it. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thanks again for the great discussion, Wolfgang. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWaves. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep them coupled. Gone straight away.